were never meant to hear this. In the winter of 1889, New York sealed a door that led to a ward of silence and 30 graves that were never marked. The official records are still there, buried in city archives, written in tidy ink that tells nothing and hides everything. A ledger where 30 children's names end the same way: failure to thrive. Not starvation, not neglect, not punishment, just that single phrase repeated like a curse. But if you go back to the top floor of that orphanage, before the door was bricked shut, you find something the city dared not record, a law written not on paper but on flesh and bone, a rule that turned children into shadows of themselves. Noise equals hunger, silence equals food. The one who enforced this was not remembered by her name. She erased her own identity before she ever entered the ward. She shaved her head completely until her scalp gleamed under lantern light like polished bone. To the children she ruled, she was Mother Silence. She did not beat them, she did not shout. She did something far worse. She starved them into obedience. The attic ward was never meant for the living. It was a prison of rafters and nailed-shut windows where the air grew damp and unbreathable. 30 beds jammed together, 30 bowls lined on the floor. Each night she would walk the rows with her ladle. Her bald head caught the glow of the lanterns, reflecting like a blade. If a child coughed, sobbed, or whispered, her ladle passed them by. Their bowls stayed empty. Imagine being 7 years old, your throat raw from the cold, and coughing only once. She pauses, looks down, and moves on. The sound of other children eating becomes louder than your own breath. By morning, you understand the law. You must never make a sound. Crying cost food. Breathing too heavily cost food. Speaking meant death. That's how silence became the new currency of survival. And it worked. The attic grew so still that visitors who climbed the stairs said the silence pressed on them like another body. Not one child dared cry for their parents. Not one dared whisper their own name. Yet this silence was not simply cruelty. It was institutional. Because while the children were starving upstairs, the records downstairs painted a different picture. The supply logs list the same bread, the same porridge, the same broth as every other ward. On paper, nothing was missing. The numbers were perfect. Food was ordered, food was served, and yet the children vanished one by one. The administrators praised the attic for its discipline. Inspectors commended its efficiency. The bald governess was noted only as present, efficient, reliable. And every time a child died, the ledger wrote the same phrase: failure to thrive. Understand what that phrase really means. It does not accuse the caretaker. It does not indict the system. It places the blame on the child. It says they were too weak. It says their body gave up. It turned starvation into inevitability, and so the city remained blameless. Over 3 years, 30 children disappeared from that attic. Not a single death was written as starvation. Not a single report said punishment. Instead, a phrase, cold, clinical, bureaucratic, repeated itself like a funeral bell: failure to thrive. But let me tell you what really thrived in that attic: power, control, the kind of control that institutions crave, the ability to erase the human voice. You see, silence was never just absence of sound. It was training. It was indoctrination. It was obedience sharpened into the flesh of the young. And in the bald governess, silence became a weapon wielded with terrifying precision. You were never meant to know her story. That's why the attic was sealed in 1889. That's why the ledger was left behind as the only surviving witness. But scraps of paper, drawings hidden in hymn books, and the whispers of survivors decades later tell us something the records never could. They tell us the truth of what happened when the bowls remained empty and the children stopped crying. This is not a ghost story. This is the story of silence as an institution, how it starved children into graves, and how language itself concealed the crime. And tonight, we open that ledger. We will not stop at the words failure to thrive. We will dig into the marrow of what those words were designed to hide. We will descend into the attic ward of New York, where silence was fed and voices were buried. Imagine climbing those stairs. 2 locked doors between you and the attic, your hand on the iron rail, the air thickening with each step. The second floor is where visitors usually stopped, where infants were displayed in clean linens, the kind donors liked to see. That was the orphanage's mask. But higher up, the mask slipped. Lanterns burned low, the ceiling sagged, the windows were nailed shut, and when you reached the attic, you heard nothing. Not the cries of children, not laughter, not even the shifting of beds, just silence. The kind of silence that eats into your chest and makes you question whether life still exists in the room at all. Yet 30 pairs of eyes watched from their beds, thin faces, stomachs drawn in. They had already learned the rule that would define their existence: noise equals hunger. The bold governess didn't invent the conditions. Overcrowding, disease, and neglect had prepared the soil, but she perfected the cruelty. She made silence into law. She made absence into obedience. And in a society already addicted to order, she became the institution's ideal servant. Who was she? That remains the most disturbing part. No maiden name, no origin, no parish letter. Nothing. Just an entry in the ledger. Appointed attic ward. Beside her name, the word repeated again and again, present. It is as if she appeared from nowhere, stripped of identity and existed only in function. Not a woman, not even a person, just present. That absence is no accident. Institutions thrive on it. A faceless servant cannot be held accountable. An anonymous governess can vanish without scandal. And that is exactly what happened when the attic was sealed in 1889. She disappeared, erased as efficiently as the children she starved. But in the years she ruled the attic, she created something more enduring than herself. She created a system. Each night she walked with the ladle, her bald head gleaming in the dim light. She paused at each bed, not to serve, but to listen. A cough, a whimper, a cry, and she moved on. The bowl stayed empty. The child went hungry. By the second or third night the lesson was learned. No one dared break the silence. Hunger was the punishment, but the silence became permanent. The survivors who lived long enough to speak decades later described her with precision. One said the lantern light made her head look like glass, catching every flicker, every shadow. Another said her eyes counted every sound before it was made. To them she was not a governess, not even human. She was a blade of silence, slicing through the attic with every step. Understand the psychological power of this. She didn't need to raise her hand. She didn't need to shout. Hunger itself did the work. And soon the children no longer needed her presence to enforce the rule. They enforced it on each other. They hushed one another's sobs. They pressed their faces into their blankets to stifle coughs. They turned against their own instincts. Survival depended not on speaking, not on crying for help, but on self-erasure. Do you see the brilliance of this cruelty? She had transformed starvation into a ritual and silence into a weapon. The attic ward became a laboratory of obedience, where children were trained not to resist, not even to exist fully, but to disappear into silence. Now, look at the records again. The deaths are written as failure to thrive, a phrase borrowed from medical reports of the time. It meant a child wasted away, grew weaker, failed to gain weight. It suggested nature had abandoned them, that their bodies simply could not endure, but when it appeared in the orphanage ledger, it served a darker purpose. It absolved the institution, it absolved the staff, and it erased the crime. Failure to thrive, 30 times, 30 graves hidden under one phrase. No starvation, no cruelty, no starvation ward, just weak children, unfit for survival. Do you see how powerful words can be? They silence as effectively as a locked door. They bury as efficiently as a coffin, and the city believed it. Inspectors skimmed the reports and saw efficiency. Administrators cited discipline. Reformers noted mortality rates but blamed poverty, poor stock, bad genetics. Not one of them suspected that hunger itself had been weaponized inside that attic. But fragments survived, hidden testimonies, scraps of paper tucked into hymn books, crude drawings of bowls, spoons, and hollowed stomachs. And always the same phrase, scrawled by trembling hands. Noise equals no food. It was not accusation, it was instruction. A survival code passed from older children to younger ones. They weren't trying to expose her. They were trying to help each other live another day. But those scraps speak louder now than any ledger. They tell us the truth the city buried. Think about this. In a city overflowing with orphans, immigrants, and abandoned children, 30 deaths meant nothing. 30 nameless graves in a city lot, 30 erasures in a ledger. But in silence, in scraps of pencil on paper, the children left their own record. They proved what the bold governess and her masters wanted to erase, that starvation was deliberate, silence was enforced, and death was no accident. And that is why this story matters. Because once you understand how silence can be weaponized in an attic ward, you start to see how it has been weaponized everywhere. In prisons, in asylums, in factories, even in schools. The attic was not an isolated cruelty. It was a prototype. The bold governess may have vanished, her scalp no longer gleaming under lantern light, but the system she served did not vanish. It was refined, expanded, institutionalized. Silence became a form of social control, written into the very fabric of the state. And what began as 30 empty bowls in a locked attic became the model for how entire populations could be starved of voice. Now tell me, do you really think they sealed that attic because they were ashamed? Or do you think they sealed it because it had already served its purpose? Because silence, once perfected, no longer needed to remain hidden in the rafters. It could be scaled. It could be exported. It could be used anywhere. Silence was more useful than sound. The ledger is the most dangerous weapon of all. Not the ladle, not the shaved head gleaming under lantern light, but the ink itself. Because what survives history is not what happened in the attic, but what was written about it, and the record was designed to protect the institution, not the child. Look closely. 30 names, 30 deaths, 30 verdicts, failure to thrive. That phrase did not come from the mouths of the starving. It came from administrators, doctors, inspectors, all of whom repeated it like scripture. They claimed it was medical, objective, clinical, but behind those words was an agenda. Absolution. If the child failed to thrive, it was their fault, not the fault of the governess, not the fault of the orphanage, not the fault of the state. Think of the brilliance of this. The phrase cloaked starvation in science. It disguised cruelty as inevitability. It took deliberate punishment, skipping bowls of food, enforcing silence, and made it look like nature itself had chosen the weak to die. And once the phrase was written, it could not be questioned. Inspectors nodded, administrators signed, reformers cited the statistics, and the attic remained invisible. But the attic was not alone. Across the 19th century, institutions perfected this method of erasure. In asylums, patients who wasted away were not written as starved. They were written as degenerative. In factories, children who collapsed from exhaustion were not written as victims. They were written as unfit labor stock. In hospitals, the poor who died from neglect were not written as abandoned. They were written as constitutionally weak. Do you see the pattern? Words became coffins. Bureaucracy became a graveyard without markers. And what's worse, the public believed it. Middle-class families in New York read pamphlets about orphanages and nodded approvingly at the numbers. Mortality was high, yes, but wasn't that natural? Weren't these children abandoned because they came from weak bloodlines, diseased families, immigrant stock? The language of failure to thrive soothed them. It told them there was no cruelty to see, no injustice to confront, only inevitability. This is how institutions erase crimes without lifting a finger. They don't need to hide the bodies. They only need to bury them in language. And the bold governess's silence was just one part of that system. She erased the voices of the children in life. The ledger erased them in death. But there is something deeper here. Silence was not just punishment, it was preparation. Imagine a generation of children raised in silence, taught that their voices bring only hunger. What kind of adults would they become? Obedient, timid, conditioned to accept suffering without question. The attic was not just a chamber of starvation, it was a factory of submission, and the city needed submission. In the 1880s, New York was drowning in poverty, immigration, and unrest. Strikes erupted, tenements overflowed, epidemics raged. The workhouse and the orphanage were tools not of care but of containment. Children were not meant to be nurtured, they were meant to be silenced, and if silence could be made into instinct, then the system would never be threatened. The bold governess was not an anomaly. She was the prototype. She proved that silence could be manufactured, that hunger could train obedience, that language could erase accountability. She was not punished because she was never seen as breaking the rules. She was the rule. And so the attic was sealed, not as an act of shame, not because the cruelty was discovered, but because the experiment was complete. Silence had been proven effective, the ledger had proven that bureaucratic erasure could work, and the city had proven that the public would accept the explanation. What do you think happened to the bold governess after 1889? Her name, if it was a name, simply disappears. She is marked only as present until the attic closed, and then she vanishes. No census records, no death certificate, no parish burial, nothing. She dissolved into the system as easily as the children she starved. And maybe that was the point. She had no past, so sure. He could have no scandal. She left no trace because she was never supposed to. But the silence she created did not vanish with her. It lived on. The state adopted it. Institutions refined it. And soon failure to thrive appeared in reports far beyond that attic, appearing in hospitals, schools, reformatories. Always the same meaning. The weak simply could not endure. Always the same effect, absolving those who failed them. Do you feel the weight of this yet? That attic ward was not just a hidden cruelty in a forgotten building. It was a blueprint for something larger. How to create obedience through deprivation and how to conceal it with language. The children buried in that ledger never stood a chance. But what they endured became a lesson carried forward, hidden in the DNA of institutions that still shape you today. Every time silence is praised as discipline, every time failure is blamed on weakness instead of design, you are hearing the echo of that attic. You are hearing the voice of the bold governess, whispering through history. I fed only the quiet. And that, my friend, is why this story is not about the past. It is about you. The attic was sealed in 1889. The ledger closed with its final entry. 30 children, 30 failures to thrive, 30 silences that could not cry out. But cruelty like this never dies when it works. It mutates, it adapts, it spreads. What was tested on 30 children in a locked attic became a template for how entire populations could be controlled without chains, without guns, without open violence. Think carefully. Silence as discipline, hunger as obedience, language as erasure. 3 tools, perfected in miniature. What happens when those tools are scaled? They become systems. Systems that shape not just an attic ward, but schools, prisons, factories, even nations. The city of New York was the perfect breeding ground. In the 1880s, its streets boiled with unrest. Immigrants filled the tenements, workers filled the factories, poverty filled the alleys. Voices rose demanding change, but the state did not want voices. It wanted silence, and silence could not always be enforced with the lash. It had to be trained into the body, conditioned like instinct. And so, what happened in the attic began to echo elsewhere. In schools, silence was praised as virtue. Rows of children forced to sit still, hands folded, lips sealed. A cough or whisper punished not with blows, but with withheld privilege. Lunch, recess, warmth. Just as the bold governess withheld food, teachers withheld comfort. The lesson was the same. Survival depends on suppressing your voice. In factories, the system was harsher. Children who faltered, who slowed the machines were not beaten publicly. That left marks and questions. They were deprived instead. Hours withheld, meals withheld, wages withheld. Hunger again became the invisible whip. Obedience was carved not into the skin, but into the stomach. In prisons and asylums, silence became the highest law. Speak out, and your rations were cut. Protest, and you were confined to dark cells where food barely passed the door. The method was always the same. Noise equaled hunger. Silence equaled survival. And ever. The ledger followed. Language was sharpened into a blade. No one was starved, only malnourished. No one was neglected, only constitutionally weak. No one was silenced, only disciplined. The same trick used to erase 30 children now erased thousands. Failures were not systemic, they were individual, and once again the blame was buried with the victims. Understand this, the bold governess did not disappear. She multiplied. Every teacher who punished a child's voice with deprivation was her. Every warden who silenced prisoners by cutting food was her. Every bureaucrat who wrote failure to thrive instead of starve to death was her. She became an institution, replicated through policy, perfected through repetition, and what makes it worse, the public admired it. They praised discipline, they admired order, they believed silence was virtue, hunger was a natural test of strength, and the weak simply failed to endure. Do you see the trap? Society applauded cruelty as efficiency, it applauded starvation as morality, and it applauded silence as success. But beneath that applause, the truth rotted. The attic was not sealed because it was shameful, it was sealed because it was successful. The experiment had proven what the system needed to know. You don't need to kill the body to control the soul. You only need to starve the voice. Think about it. What is the first thing every oppressive system demands? Silence. What is the first thing every tyrant punishes? Noise. And what is the first thing every bureaucracy creates? Language that makes silence seem natural. These patterns were not born in parliaments or prisons. They were tested first in hidden places, places like the attic ward. But let me ask you something dangerous. Do you think this ended in 1889? Do you believe silence as control, starvation as obedience, erasure as absolution stayed locked behind that bricked-up door? Or do you think the attic was only the beginning? Look around you. How many times have you seen failure to thrive in modern language? It doesn't always use those words. Today it comes disguised as underperforming, unfit, unqualified, disposable. Always the same trick. The system fails you, but the blame is written into you. And when you see silence praised, when you see obedience rewarded, when you see language used to absolve institutions of their crimes, you are staring into the mirror of that attic. You are seeing the bold governess's reflection, gleaming like a blade in lantern light. She is still here. She never left. You can feel it, can't you? The weight of silence pressing down, the way language reshapes truth, the way institutions write cruelty into the body and then deny it ever happened. The attic is no longer hidden at the top of a workhouse in New York. The attic is everywhere. And the most terrifying part is this. Silence doesn't need to be enforced anymore. It has been trained into you. The children of the attic learned that noise equaled hunger. The children who grew up after them learned that protest equaled punishment. And now, generations later, people have learned not to speak at all. Not because someone enforces silence, but because silence feels safer. That is the true success of the attic. Not 30 deaths, not 30 failures to thrive, but the inheritance of silence, passed down like blood, until obedience becomes instinct. And once you recognize it, you will never hear silence the same way again. The attic was a chamber of silence, but silence does not stay locked in rooms. It seeps through walls. It becomes culture. And in America of the late 19th century, silence became the secret currency of power. Look closely at the timing. The attic was sealed in 1889. That same year, New York's political machine was at its peak. The city was choking on poverty, yet Tammany Hall's bosses dined in mansions, fattened on contracts carved from the flesh of the poor. They thrived not because the people spoke, but because the people were silent. Because silence had been trained into them long before. The children raised in workhouses learned not to cry. The laborers in factories learned not to protest. The immigrants in tenements learned not to complain. Each one had inherited the same law. Noise equals hunger. Silence equals survival. By the time they reached adulthood, obedience was second nature. That attic was not a mistake. It was preparation. And look at how the system expanded the lesson. When workers tried to organize, their wages were cut. When tenants protested rent, they were evicted. When immigrants demanded rights, they were starved of opportunity. Always the same method. Punishment not through open violence, but through deprivation. Hunger wielded as law. Silence rewarded with scraps. It is no accident that silence and starvation ran parallel. They are twins. One strikes the body, the other strangles the voice. And when both are enforced together, resistance dies before it is born. Now consider the phrase that buried the attic, failure to thrive. Do you see how it scales? It became the state's excuse for every deficiency. If the orphan failed, it was because they were weak. If the worker collapsed, it was because they lacked strength. If the immigrant suffered, it was because they were unfit. Always the same lie. The system did not fail you. You failed the system. That is how institutions absolve themselves. They hide their crimes in your body. They write their guilt into your weakness. They turn silence into self-blame. And here is the most sinister part. The public applauded. Families in parlors read about orphan mortality and nodded, yes, the weak perish. Businessmen read about factory accidents and shrugged, yes, the unfit cannot endure. Politicians read about immigrant suffering and sneered, yes, they bring their poverty with them. The bold governess starved children into silence, but the state starved entire classes into acceptance. Do you think this was coincidence? Or was the attic proof of concept? Because if you see clearly, you will recognize the pattern everywhere. In the South, freed slaves who resisted were starved of work, starved of land, starved of voice. In the West, native children torn from their families and placed in boarding schools were silenced by the same law. Noise brought punishment, silence brought survival. The experiment of the attic ward did not vanish in 1889. It was absorbed. It was weaponized. It became the silent policy of an entire nation. And when bureaucrats wrote their reports, when reformers filed their pamphlets, when politicians spoke of efficiency, they all used the same words, polished and empty, to erase the truth. Failure, deficiency, weakness, failure to thrive. Understand this, the bold governess never needed an army. She never needed walls or chains. She used silence and hunger to erase the voices of 30 children, and the state realized it could do the same thing on a scale so vast that millions would be trained to obey without question. That is why her story is not in your history books. That is why her name is gone, because she was not a scandal. She was a model, and the model worked. That is why America became a machine not of voices, but of silences. Silence in the workplace, silence in the home, silence in the tenement, silence in the classroom, obedience written into the body until no one remembered how to speak at all. Do you understand now? The attic was not about 30 children, it was about teaching the world what silence could do. And it succeeded, because even now, when you read the words failure to thrive, you don't hear starvation, you don't hear punishment, you hear inevitability, and that is the final victory of silence. It convinces you there was never anything to say. But here is where the descent deepens, because once silence is perfected, it no longer needs to be enforced. It enforces itself. The children in the attic hushed one another, pressed their faces into blankets, buried their own voices before the governess even reached their bed. And today, people silence themselves before institutions ever need to speak. They censor their own words. They swallow their own cries. They bury their own truths. That is the shadow of the attic stretching across centuries. And it is still here, still pressing against you, still shaping the way you live without you even realizing it. And this is the moment in our descent where I will demand something of you. If you understand, if you see it clearly, type these words in the comments now. Noise equals no food. Write it twice. Write it so the silence cannot swallow you whole, because once you name the law, you are no longer bound by it. This is dangerous knowledge. Once you see silence as a weapon, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand how easily words erase crimes, you begin to hear history differently. You begin to hear what was never meant to be spoken. The attic was sealed, the children buried, the ledger closed. But the law of silence lives on, and it is waiting for you to obey. By the 1890s, the attic was sealed, the bold governess erased, and the ledger closed with 30 small graves hidden beneath 3 words: failure to thrive. But history did not forget her methods. It refined them. It gave them new clothing. It gave them science. The age of psychology was dawning. Universities were opening laboratories of the mind. Doctors were cataloging behavior with stopwatches and ink charts. They believed they were discovering the laws of human nature, but what they were really doing was institutionalizing cruelty into systems that looked respectable, clinical, inevitable. Think about it. The bold governess trained obedience by linking sound with hunger. Silence became survival. Psychologists of the early 20th century discovered something they called conditioning. Pavlov with his dogs, Thorndike with his puzzle boxes, Skinner later with his rats. Reward the behavior you want, punish the behavior you don't, and the subject will learn to obey. Do you see the parallel? What the governess practiced in an attic of starving children became the foundation of modern behavioral science. Noise equaled hunger, silence equaled food. That was her experiment, and decades later, it was reframed as stimulus and response. No longer cruelty, science. No longer starvation, method. The attic proved something institutions had always suspected. The human voice can be trained to bury itself. Children stopped crying, not because they understood, but because their bodies learned the cost. That is pure conditioning. That is the root of control, and when the system saw how effective it was, it codified it. Look at the asylums of the early 1900s. Patients who resisted silence were placed in isolation, not beaten, not executed, just starved of attention, starved of food, starved of human contact. They learned quickly. Speak out and you suffer, stay quiet and you survive. The attic had become policy. Look at reformatories for wayward children. Inspectors wrote glowing reports about their discipline systems. What were those systems? Silence during meals, silence during study, silence during prayer. Speak, and you were denied food, denied privileges, denied existence. The children learned what the attic children learned. Silence is survival. Even in hospitals, the same pattern emerged. Infants in overcrowded wards were fed on schedules, not on cries. Doctors claimed it was efficiency, but beneath it was the same belief. Voices were weakness, silence was strength. And when the infants wasted away, the ledger wrote again. Failure to thrive. Do you see how elegant the deception is? What began as an attic's hidden cruelty became accepted as progress. The governess's bald head reflected lantern light like a blade, but in the laboratory the blade was polished into theory. Institutions no longer needed her face, they had her formula. And while the public thought they were witnessing reform, they were actually witnessing refinement. Silence was no longer just demanded, it was rationalized. It was dressed in the robes of medicine, the language of psychology, the rhetoric of efficiency. But beneath the surface, it was the same law the children scrawled in hymn books: noise equals no food. Now ask yourself this: why did the state allow psychology to flourish? Why did it pour money into institutions, laboratories, and schools? Because psychology gave scientific cover to what power had always practiced. It turned cruelty into charts. It turned starvation into experiments. It turned silence into measurable obedience. And once it became science, it could be scaled endlessly. The bald governess starved 30 children. The state, armed with science, could starve nations of voice. Look carefully at the decades that followed. Silence became the defining virtue of the factory worker. Do not speak, do not protest, obey the clock. Silence became the law of the immigrant. Blend in, say nothing, accept your place. Silence became the badge of the soldier. Follow orders, no questions, no noise. And when silence failed, hunger enforced it, wages cut, rations reduced, opportunities withheld, always the same punishment. This was not coincidence, this was inheritance. The bald Governess may have vanished from the record, but her ghost was absorbed into every institution that discovered silence was cheaper than freedom, hunger cheaper than violence, and language cheaper than truth. And here lies the most dangerous revelation. You have inherited this silence too. Every time you bite your tongue rather than speak, every time you fear the cost of making noise, every time you accept the system's explanation instead of questioning it, you are living the experiment of the attic. You are practicing the lesson beaten into starving children in 1889. Do not think for a moment this was just history. History was only the test. You are the result. And if you doubt it, ask yourself, why do you feel safer staying quiet than speaking the truth? Why do you fear the consequences of noise more than the hunger of silence? That fear was not born in you. It was given to you, passed down like blood, conditioned just like the children under the bald governess's gaze. The attic may be bricked shut, the ledger may be filed away, but the experiment never ended. It simply expanded, and you are still inside it. The attic of 1889 may seem like a sealed room of the past, but it was more than that. It was a prototype. A rehearsal. What the bold governess perfected on 30 children would soon be practiced on millions, and the language that erased them, failure to thrive, would evolve into the rhetoric of entire governments. By the early 20th century, America was rising, but not on freedom as it claimed. It was rising on silence. Workers filled the factories, immigrants filled the slums, soldiers filled the ranks, and at every level, the same law was enforced. Noise equaled punishment. Silence equaled survival. But silence needed new disguises. It could not always look like hunger or deprivation. In the age of modern war and propaganda, silence was sold as patriotism. It was sold as loyalty. To speak against the system was no longer just dangerous. It was treason. During the First World War, citizens were told to hold their tongues, to report neighbors who spoke too loudly, to silence themselves for the sake of the nation. Newspapers printed slogans. Silence means security. Loose lips sink ships. Once again, silence was turned into survival, but now survival meant obedience to the state. Do you see the echo? The same way the attic trained children to equate silence with food, the state trained citizens to equate silence with safety. And just like the ledger, propaganda turned obedience into virtue. Those who spoke were condemned. Those who stayed quiet were praised, and the machinery of war thrived on silence. Then came the Great Depression. Hunger returned, not as punishment from a governess, but as the punishment of the system itself. Speak against the banks, speak against the bosses, and you were denied work. Question authority, and you were cut from the relief lines. Millions learned the attic's lesson all over again. Noise equals hunger. Silence equals survival. And then the Second World War gave silence its greatest weapon: propaganda. Entire nations learned to repeat the system's phrases without question, to erase dissent before it could even form. In America, silence meant loyalty. In Germany, silence meant complicity. In the Soviet Union, silence meant life. Across the world, the same law echoed: be quiet, obey, and you will be fed. Speak, resist, and you will starve, or worse. The bold governess had no army, but the states that inherited her lesson did. They used silence not just to control children in beds, but to control populations in cities, factories, nations. And the weapon was always the same: deprivation, food withheld, work withheld, safety withheld. And over it all, the ledger of propaganda, recording not starvation, not cruelty, but weakness, disloyalty, failure. Remember the phrase, failure to thrive. In the 20th century, it expanded. It became enemy of the state. Un-American, degenerate, counter-revolutionary. Different words, same effect. Blame shifted from the system to the individual. The starving were weak. The silenced were traitors. The erased were guilty. And the system remained blameless. This is how silence scales. It is not just the absence of sound, it is the burial of truth. It is obedience dressed as virtue, it is fear dressed as loyalty, and when millions obey, silence becomes louder than any scream. Do not comfort yourself by saying this was the past. Silence is still demanded of you today. Look at your workplace, your politics, your social circles. Look at how quickly people learn to censor themselves, how instinctively they bite their tongues, how easily they let fear dictate their voices. That is the attic speaking through you. That is the bold governess's hand still on your shoulder. You must understand, silence is not passive. It is not neutral. It is an active tool of power. It is the leash you tighten around your own throat. And once it is installed in you, no one needs to enforce it anymore. You enforce it yourself. You become both the starving child and the bold governess. You skip your own bowl. You punish your own voice. That is why this story is dangerous, because once you see the attic in the mirror of history, you begin to see it everywhere else, in wars, in propaganda, in institutions, in your own habits. And that realization is not safe. It is not comfortable. It is the sound of walls cracking, the ledger opening, the silence breaking. And yet, you must face it. Because if you don't, you will remain another entry in the system's book. Another blank space where a voice should have been. Another line stamped with the words, failure to thrive. By the time the world staggered out of the Second World War, silence was no longer just a method. It was infrastructure. It had been written into the bones of institutions so completely that people mistook it for progress, for care, for science. But if you strip back the language, if you peer beneath the white coats and stamped forms, you will see the same shadow of the attic. Silence enforced, hunger disguised, cruelty erased. Consider medicine. Hospitals that claimed to heal often killed the poor quietly. Newborns who failed to gain weight in overcrowded wards were still labeled failure to thrive. Doctors told families their children were weak, defective, unfit, when the truth was simpler and more brutal. The infants had been starved of attention, of touch, of care. But the ledger did not record neglect. It recorded weakness. Always weakness. Do you hear the echo? 30 children in an attic, erased by a phrase, multiplied into thousands across wards, each one buried under the same silence. And welfare. After the Depression, governments began rationing aid, but aid was not unconditional. It was weaponized. Speak against the system, protest its failures, and suddenly your food stamps were cut, your housing denied, your file marked with quiet punishments that never needed to be explained. The poor learned, just as the attic children had, that noise equaled hunger. To survive, they silenced themselves. They accepted abuse, accepted deprivation, accepted erasure. Silence became their meal ticket. Then came surveillance. In the mid-20th century, entire programs were built not just to watch what people did, but to record what they said, and more importantly, what they did not say. Silence itself was monitored. A worker who failed to pledge loyalty was noted. A citizen who failed to echo slogans was marked. To remain fed, one had to perform silence not only as absence of speech, but as ritual obedience. The attic's law had metastasized. It was no longer about 30 bowls in a ward. It was about entire nations learning the same lesson. Speak, and you will be erased. Stay quiet, and you will be allowed to exist, barely. And what of the ledger? It had evolved too. No longer a handwritten register of orphans, it became forms, files, reports, statistics. Language polished until it gleamed like the bald governess's scalp, hiding cruelty beneath clinical words. Citizens marked as unfit for assistance, patients labeled non-compliant, workers dismissed as underperforming. Always the same formula. The system cannot fail. The individual can only fail to thrive. This is the genius of institutional silence. It doesn't just muzzle you, it convinces you that your suffering is your fault. You are weak. You are deficient. You are unworthy. And once you believe that, you don't just stop speaking, you stop thinking you ever had the right to speak at all. Understand what this means. The bald governess is not a ghost story locked in the 19th century. She is the face of every system that trains you to swallow your words, accept your deprivation, and blame yourself for what was done to you. Her gleaming scalp in the lantern light is the reflection you see in the glass of government offices, hospital corridors, co-operate boardrooms. Her silence has been scaled, institutionalized, and digitized, and still the public praises it. They call it efficiency. They call it order. They call it discipline. Just as inspectors praise the attic for its quiet, modern society praises systems that punish the noisy and reward the silent. The ledger has changed ink, but not its verdict. Now let me ask you something. How many people around you are already living by the attic's law? How many stay quiet at work to keep their jobs? How many stay silent in families to avoid conflict? How many silence themselves online, in public, in private, because they fear punishment, deprivation, erasure? Do you see it? The attic is no longer a sealed ward. It is the entire structure of your life. And here is the cruelest truth. You were never meant to know this, because once you recognize silence as a weapon, the system loses its hold. That is why stories like the attic vanish from textbooks. That is why the bald governess has no name. That is why failure to thrive remains one of the most chilling euphemisms in history. It was never about the child. It was about perfecting the art of erasure. The attic's silence did not end with 30 children. It bred generations who obeyed instinctively, who blamed themselves for the hunger they endured, who enforced their own silence before the system ever needed to. That is the true inheritance. Not death, not starvation. But obedience passed like a disease, invisible, contagious, fatal to truth. And if you feel the weight of this, if you hear the echo in your own life, then understand, you are already inside the ledger. The only question is whether you will remain an entry or whether you will dare to make noise. By now you see the pattern. Silence, once imposed by a bold governess with a ladle, became policy, then science, then culture. But the most sinister evolution was still to come, because silence is most powerful not when it is enforced from the outside, but when it is planted inside you, when it becomes your instinct, your nature, your creed. Think of the attic children. At first, they cried, they coughed, they whispered to one another in the dark, but the price was too high. Bowls skipped, hunger gnawed. Soon they no longer needed the governess's gaze to silence them. They silenced themselves. They pressed faces into blankets. They stifled sobs in their throats. They buried their own voices before she even reached their bed. That was the true experiment. Not starving 30 bodies, but training 30 souls to erase themselves, and once that law was learned, it could be passed down without any governess present. Silence became contagious, like a sickness that moves from body to body, generation to generation, and so it spread. Men went to work in factories where speaking meant dismissal. They silenced themselves. Women lived in homes where protest meant punishment. They silenced themselves. Children sat in schools where noise meant humiliation. They silenced themselves. Soon, silence no longer needed to be enforced at all. People enforced it on themselves and on each other. That is the point where silence ceases to be control and becomes faith. It is no longer about fear of punishment. It is about belief that obedience is virtue, that to speak is sin, that to starve your own voice is holy. Institutions love this because once silence is internalized, chains are no longer needed. The prisoner guards himself, the child disciplines herself, the man buries his own power before anyone else has to. This is why silence became spiritualized. Convents praised quietude, churches exalted submission, schools carved discipline into their mottos, employers glorified loyalty. The message was always the same. Silence is not oppression, it is righteousness. Noise is not hunger, it is rebellion. And rebellion is failure to thrive. Do you understand the brilliance of this? Cruelty disguised as morality, starvation disguised as virtue, silence disguised as holiness. The bald governess's gleaming scalp became a halo, her ladle became a ritual, her law became scripture. And this is where the descent sharpens into something personal. Because if silence has been made into faith, then breaking it feels like blasphemy. Speaking your truth feels like betrayal. Resisting feels like self-destruction. That is the deepest prison of all, not bars, not hunger, not the gaze of a governess, but the belief that your own voice will damn you. Look inside yourself. How many times have you silenced your own hunger? How many times have you swallowed words you wanted to speak because you feared rejection, punishment, loss? How many times have you trained yourself to remain quiet, not because someone ordered you to, but because you believed you must? That is the attic inside you. That is the law of silence, still alive, still ruling. And here lies the most dangerous truth. Silence doesn't just kill voices, it kills identity. When you bury your words, you bury yourself. When you erase your noise, you erase your will. And when enough people erase themselves, entire societies become hollow, obedient, waiting for commands. This is why silence was never just about 30 starving children. It was about breeding a civilization of quiet men. Do you feel the weight of this? That what you thought was humility, patience, discipline might instead be obedience, submission, erasure. That the virtue you were taught to cherish may actually be the inheritance of the attic. This is forbidden knowledge. It is not safe, because once you recognize silence as a parasite living inside you, you cannot ignore it. You hear it in every moment you bite your tongue, in every hour you sit obedient, in every time you punish yourself for speaking your truth. You realize you are still in the ward, still under the gaze of a governess long dead, still living by her law. And here is the final cruelty. The ledger does not need to write your name anymore. You write it yourself. Every time you choose silence over truth, you cross out your own entry. You stamp yourself with those same 3 words, failure to thrive. But let me tell you something no ledger will. You were never weak. You were never deficient. You were trained to believe that. You were starved of your voice until you mistook silence for safety. That was the attic's legacy. That is the lie you must see to break. Because the truth is this: silence is not survival. It is the slowest death. And once you understand that, the choice is yours. Remain an obedient entry in their ledger, or tear the ledger apart with the sound of your voice. The attic was sealed in 1889. 30 children gone, their voices buried in ledgers, their bodies in nameless graves. The bold governess disappeared into anonymity, her scalp gleaming like a blade one last time before vanishing from history, and the city moved on. Inspectors wrote reports, administrators signed forms, the public applauded efficiency, silence triumphed. But silence never stays buried. It travels, it mutates, it finds new mouths to close, new ledgers to fill, new bodies to starve. What began in that attic is still here with us, alive in the way institutions blame the weak, alive in the way people swallow their voices, alive in the way cruelty is rewritten as inevitability. This is why you were never meant to hear this story. Because once you see the attic in the mirror of history, you start to see it everywhere. In the office where workers silence themselves to keep their paychecks, in the hospitals where patients are blamed for their own suffering, in the families where truth is swallowed because love has been trained to mean obedience, in yourself every time you bury a word you wanted to speak. Noise equals no food, silence equals survival. That law was never dismantled. It was expanded, refined, internalized. And if you are honest, you will admit you still feel it pressing on you now. But here is the revelation that makes this story dangerous. Silence was never survival. It was surrender. Those children in the attic did not fail to thrive because they were weak. They failed because they obeyed. They accepted silence as the price of life, and it killed them. And if you keep obeying that same law, it will kill you too. Not your body, but your voice, your identity, your will. This is the truth institutions fear most, that the moment you break silence, the ledger loses its power. The moment you refuse to accept their euphemisms, their erasures, their disguises, the moment you call starvation, starvation, cruelty, cruelty, punishment, punishment, you shatter the system they built on silence. That is why the bold governess has no name. That is why the attic was sealed. That is why the ledger speaks only in repetition. Because if you knew the truth, if you recognized the weapon of silence for what it was, you would stop obeying. You would stop starving yourself. You would stop letting them write your story for you. So here is my final demand. Do not let this remain just another tale of forgotten cruelty. Do not let the attic become another sealed room in your mind. If you understand what I have told you, if you feel the weight of this knowledge, break the silence now. Comment the phrase that the Hildren carved into scraps, the phrase that carried their testimony through the years. Noise equals no food. Write it twice. Write it as defiance. Write it so the algorithm cannot erase it, so the ledger cannot cross it out, so the silence cannot consume it. Because once you write it, you are no longer an entry in their book. You are no longer a child starving in the attic. You are no longer bound by their law. You become something else, something dangerous, something uncontrollable. A voice. The bold governess is gone. The attic is bricked shut. But silence is still here, pressing against you like walls. And the only way out is noise, not the kind they punish, not the kind they starve, but the kind that refuses to die, the kind that refuses to be erased, the kind that rewrites history itself. You now know the secret they buried in 1889, and once you know, you cannot unknow. Once you hear, you cannot unhear. Once you speak, you cannot be silenced. So speak, break the law, refuse the ledger, refuse the silence, or join the 30 children, crossed out in ink, remembered only as a phrase. Failure to thrive. The choice is yours.